Drums are the foundations of your track. They make everything else fall into place if done well and can go a long way in keeping the track interesting and engaging. These 5 tips apply to all genres, so be sure to stay to the end, and I've even got a bonus tip at the end for those who stay. If you follow along with me, I guarantee you'll be making better drums today. So let's get into it. So I'm just going to play through this first drum loop. There's nothing wrong with it, but after a few minutes, it's definitely going to sound repetitive and the listener's not going to feel very engaged to it. The drum loop on the right here is going to showcase the 5 tips that I'm going to walk through today. So I'll play that through. If you have headphones on, you'll hear that there's a few subtle nuances that are helping keep the track interesting. So tip number 1, sound selection and layering. Choosing the right sample from the beginning makes life a whole lot easier for you. Think about the style that you're making. If you're making an old school track, then maybe sound quality isn't something you're going to be super strict with. Sometimes those artifacts in samples that have been ripped actually give it that old school feel that you might be after. If you want to make it sound like you have a real drummer playing, then make sure you get some samples that have been recorded from live drummers themselves. So by having these samples that already fit the genre and your characteristics that you're after, it's going to help everything else fall into place. You can take this a step further by layering different characteristics, because sometimes an acoustic snare doesn't have the low end that you'd get from a drum machine. So I'm getting the best of both worlds in this kick here, because I've got the low end from a disco kick. It's got that really nice low end, but with a bit of top end to it as well, it's going to help it stand out a lot better. So I've got an acoustic kick sample here that I've EQ'd the bottom out with. If I take out the acoustic kick, it's night and day the difference, and it actually goes a long way even though it's at minus 10 dB. So sound selection and layering is a great place to start when you're making your drum loops, and it's going to help build a really solid foundation for the rest of your track as it progresses. Tip number 2, variation. Subtle nuances go a long way when trying to keep the listener engaged for multiple minutes. So if I look at my snare drums here, this is showcasing a bit of that variation. I've got a snare here on the 4th beat that's playing 3 different samples. So if I'm just going to play that through. Now, if you noticed, I've got a bit of reverb happening on this second one. So that means this first snare is going to be completely dry, just at the regular snare. I've got a reverb at nearly 6% on this second one. Then we're going back to the third one dry. And then the fourth one's got more reverb at 8%. And then it's got this second snare that's playing that variation. So by having a regular snare here with that same snare with a tiny bit of reverb on it, back to the regular snare, and then with the layer here, that's creating so much more depth than if I just had this regular snare playing at every second beat, just like I did in that first loop. I've also got a reverb here on this snare variation, which is helping it sound a lot bigger. So I'll just play this loop through again, and hopefully by knowing the subtle differences I've done, you can hear the difference that it makes in the mix. So another way that you can create variation is in your hi-hats. If I had have drawn this in MIDI, I would have adjusted the velocity notes here, and that way it would have created a more human feel. But sometimes I like using drum loops that have been recorded from an actual drummer, so that way you're going to get that humanization that I was just talking about. So I'll just solo this loop now. So already there's a lot of variation in that because there's some notes that are louder than the other, but you've also got this open one at the end here. So I always like having an open hat at the second or at the end of the 4th bar, help that loop feel like it's coming around again and that there's potentially a change in the track happening. Using percussion as a call and response can also help variate the track. I've got this percussion call here, and then it's responding here with this one. So if I solo these two together, you can hear it. And I've taken that a step further by panning the first one to the left and the second one to right. I've also added variation to the percussion in the second half of the loop. Instead of just making it a 2-bar loop, it's now a 4-bar loop. So by the first one hitting that first time and then the second one following, that's creating that call and response. And these are just happening in the background to help create a bit of variation and movement and depth. Tip number 3, velocity and placement. I've already touched on velocity a little bit, and here's an example of it. I've got my shaker loop here. And if you notice, I've got all different velocities playing, which is helping create a lot of movement. If you don't know what velocity is, it's just how hard or how soft the note's been hit. So the higher the velocity, the harder that note's been hit. So although the shake is quite low in the mix, you can't really hear it. It's still going to be one of those subtle nuances that's going to help keep your track interesting after a few minutes. And just going back to tip number 2, got 2 different hats here. That's helping create that variation and a bit of difference in the loop. The placement of your samples can also be a great way to add a bit of groove to the track by placing them off the grid a bit. And I mean that just by drawing them slightly, just dragging them slightly off the grid, because we're going back to that humanization point. There's no human that can play these exactly on the right beat. Now, you can spend time just drawing them all individually off and randomly placing them, but you can also add a groove here. So what this groove does, I've got a 16th note groove here, and that means all my 16th notes are going to be shifted a little bit, make them not play on the same point every time. If you haven't used the groove function before, then I'll take you to the groove pool now. So if you go into your groove browser here, which is on your left-hand side, just search up anything that has a 16th note swing. So in Ableton 12, it's nice and easy. You just got to click the tab. If I go down to swing 16s here, the higher the number, the more swung it's going to be. So I usually like doing between 52 and 57. Anything higher than that for me is a bit too swung. So to access your groove pool, you just need to go into view and then turn on the groove pool here. And then now you can add all the grooves that you want in this little spot here. For me, it takes up a bit of space, so I'm just like having that turned off. And then I can just open up this MIDI clip and just drag in my grooves in this section down here. Swing is not something that I use in every track. And that's what I said at the start. You have to think about the genre and the characteristic you're after. There's a lot of music that needs to be straight and sounds a lot better when it is straight. And there's a lot of music that also sounds better when it's swung. And there's a lot of groove to it that you wouldn't get from a straight track. So just think about the sound that you're after and don't just add swing for the sake of it. So just to recap what we've learned so far, we've selected the right sample and layered it with the characteristic that we were looking for. We've added some variation to the loop, help it stay interesting. We've adjusted the velocity and placement of the notes, along with adding some swing to help create movement in the drums. Tip number 4, creating textures throughout your track. If I'm making an old school type of song, I love to add a bit of vinyl texture in the background, and it's at minus 25 dB, so it's super low in the mix. So by having that really low in the mix, adding these nice artifacts as if it's playing from a vinyl or maybe being put through some old tape machine. And that's an awesome characteristic to add to that style of music. Now, this is definitely one of those subtle nuances that I was talking about before. These are often really low in the mix, but creates enormous amounts of depth in your drum loops. Putting a whole bunch of effects on your drum loop and then resampling that drum loop can be a great texture to add to the loop. I've got this drum texture here, which is actually the loop fed through an effects unit. So I'll play it through. Now, it might sound weird. It might sound like it's not doing much, but it's doing a whole lot. If I take it out of the mix, now back in. And the reason why it fits so well and it sounds like it belongs is because it's the loop itself just resampled. So to resample a loop, you just insert an audio track, go into resampling, and that's going to record anything that you're playing. So I'll just solo these drums here. And if I go down to the resampling channel and I hit record, and then record at the top, it's going to record whatever audio is playing. So how I've made that drum texture is I've turned an effects unit on the drum bus, which is the drum group, and I've got Shaperbox 3, which is an audio effects unit, and it totally randomizes whatever sound or sample that you put through it. So I'll just turn that Shaperbox on now so you can hear what it's doing. That's just making it sound super weird. But like I said before, it fits really well because it's the same sounds that we're already hearing, just with a very wet effect on it. If you don't have Shaperbox 3 or any other effects unit, you can do this with the stock plugins. Just in my opinion, you don't get as good of results. But all that was doing was a bit of phaser flanging. So type in phaser flanger. That's already a nice effect that we've got going. We could throw a bit of erosion on it. You could even record yourself doing this. So when it's resampling, you could be moving this erosion around. And that's creating the exact movement that I was talking about before. You can throw delays and stuff on it too. I just feel like sometimes with delays, it can get a bit messy. But obviously done in a small manner might be good. So if I throw a grain delay on, that's the frequency. I might try the dry wet. And that's the great thing about resampling, is you can do all kinds of things to the loop. And while that's happening, it's recording everything that you're doing. And that is the exact way to create these nice textures and randomness. Tip number 5, sends and returns. I've got my send and returns here that are with my default project every time. So if you haven't adjusted that over time, then you'll just have a reverb and delay, I think it is. And if you don't know what a send and return is, it's when you have a totally wet effect down here and you're fading it in with these channel faders here. And that way you're blending your wet signal in to your sample or audio file. And it's a lot more natural sounding when you're blending those effects in rather than just throwing them onto your drum group. As you see here, the second one, it's at -18. This is a room reverb. Now, if you don't know what types of reverbs are, you have all different sizes to give you the style that you're after. So my hall reverb, I'd be using for synthesizers and instruments, vocals, and that makes it sound like it's in a hall. It's going to sound like it's quite far back in the mix. Whereas you've got this room reverb here, which is great for drums because it sounds like the drums are playing in a nice room. So if I just solo this room, it's just subtly giving it a nice bit of echo. I'll play the drum loop and I'll turn it off and see if you can hear the difference. I've already got the reverb on the snare and the snare variation, but instantly when I turned it off, you can hear all the other drums just come a lot more inward, and it totally changed the loop for the worse in my opinion. Next I've got distortion. By adding distortion, you're giving the track a lot of color because it adds all these harmonics that weren't originally there. This Camel Crusher plugin is quite intense, so I've only got it at -48 dB. If I turn down this drum loop a lot, because it's going to be seriously loud, you'll notice what I'm talking about. Drums just get instantly squashed, very distorted, which I always love the sound of distorted drums. But in this track, I wanted it to not be so intense. I'll just turn off the distortion and play it with and without. Next, I've got some parallel compression. If you're not sure what that is, I think it's going to be a whole nother video in itself. It's quite a complex topic, but essentially the idea is you have an overly intense wet signal that's coming from quite a squashed or distorted compressor or distortion unit. And by having it so intense and then blending it in only subtly, you're adding just a few of those characteristics. So I'll just play the loop with and without those return units on. Now, as promised, for staying to the end, here's a nice bonus tip for you. I've touched on this tip a little bit throughout the track, and that bonus tip is automation. I've already touched on this subtly in the snare as I've automated the reverb, but doing this to your entire drum loop is a great way to get all these 5 tips done in the one process. So examples of this, by turning on my automation tabs here and just clicking on whatever unit I want to automate. I want to do the grain delay. So I'll go up to this one here, which is G, grain delay, as you can see, and just start drawing in random patterns here. That last bit was a bit intense, but as you could hear when I was done subtly, just adding a nice layer on top of the drums, that's going to help create a lot of movement. And the great thing about automation is if you had the track that was 5 minutes, for instance, you could have this automating at the first minute and then not again to the third minute. And that way, each drum section is going to be totally different because one section is going to be automated with this effect and the other won't be. A great way to show that example by having different sections of the track automate. You might have your verse that's not heavily distorted because you obviously don't want the drums to be too intense in the verse, but you might want the chorus to just absolutely slam. So for that instance, I can automate my distortion. So right now it's at -48, it's pretty subtle. And if I duplicate everything over, I'll have the distortion playing here at -48. And then say this is the chorus here, I'll just turn that up. So by adding automation, you can have the exact same drum loop playing in the verse and the chorus, but with a whole different new characteristic to it and a whole lot more color to it to stand out in the chorus by just adding some automation in. Say as well, if you wanted to have like a build up, maybe you wanted to have, maybe I turned on this hall reverb, which is quite more intense like I spoke about before. You could have this playing just before the verse, so it sounds like it's kind of getting further away. Automating that just before the drop hits, and as soon as it drops, taking it out. On that same point of automating an effect just before the drop, you could have auto filter, which is just in your audio effects units, auto filter. So you can automate the frequency of the drums to get quieter and then back up again for the drop. Hopefully those 5 tips, along with that bonus tip as well, has shown all these subtle nuances and all these techniques to make things change and move over time can actually go a really long way throughout your tracks to keep them interesting and to more importantly, keep the listener engaged. If our tracks are going to be between 3 to 7 minutes, we need these subtle changes to happen over time. Now, just to reference these two with the actual song that this was made behind, because I've taken this loop from a song that I made. I've got the first drums that are going to be playing with the music loop, and then I'll play the drum loop with all these techniques applied to it, and we'll see if we can hear the difference between the two. These techniques will go such a long way in your productions. I can't emphasize enough the impact these little nuances are going to have in your tracks. Think about variations that can happen over time and also about automating different sections of your track. Thank you so much for staying to the end of the video. I hope these techniques were easy to follow along with and you can start implementing them in your drums today. As always, if you have any questions, please drop them below and I'll be happy to answer them. If you wanted to check out my latest upload, then just go ahead and click here. And until then, I'll see you guys in the next video.